It was a gray winter morning in 1945. The war in Europe was ending, but in the heart of Texas, silence ruled a fenced world of prisoners. Beyond the barbed wire, the wind carried the scent of dry soil and diesel. Inside Camp Hearne, hundreds of young German POWs, some barely 18, stood in line for morning roll call. Their uniforms were faded, the insignia stripped clean, yet the discipline of the Wehrmacht still lingered in their posture. Across the yard, an American sergeant carried a small wooden crate, marked personal effects, from Europe. Inside lay hundreds of lost belongings, watches, letters, wallets, and a few worn photographs found in battlefield clearings and abandoned rucksacks. When the names were read aloud, no one spoke. The prisoners stepped forward one by one. Then, the sergeant handed a trembling teenager a photograph, a mother and little sister standing by a rose garden in Bavaria. For a moment, the war fell silent. The boy's knees gave way. His hand shook. He whispered one word that none of the guards needed translated. Mutter. And that's where this story begins, with a photograph that survived the war when millions did not. By the final months of 1944, the world was unraveling. The Third Reich, once the most feared war machine in Europe, was collapsing under the combined weight of Allied firepower. On the Western Front, American and British divisions pushed through the Ardennes after the failed Battle of the Bulge. In the East, the Soviet armies were closing in on Berlin itself. Inside Germany, the cost of Hitler's fanaticism was no longer measured in land or tanks, it was measured in boys. Thousands of adolescents, members of the Hitlerjugend, were pulled from schools and factories, handed rifles far too large for their shoulders, and sent to defend a dying empire. Some were as young as 15. By the spring of 1945, entire divisions of German forces were surrendering en masse to the Allies. The Americans, moving across France and into Germany, found themselves capturing thousands of teenage soldiers, dazed, starving, and terrified. These boys had grown up under the iron weight of propaganda that taught them Americans were monsters, men who would torture and kill without mercy. But what they found was something else entirely. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, the United States treated captured enemy soldiers not as criminals, but as prisoners of war, human beings with rights. They were fed, housed, and even paid a small wage for labor. To these teenage POWs, it felt less like imprisonment and more like confusion. The enemy they had been taught to hate now handed them bread, blankets, and soap. By mid-1945, over 370,000 German POWs were held in camps across the United States, from the wheat fields of Kansas to the deserts of Arizona and the pine forests of Texas. The camps were built quickly, surrounded by barbed wire, but inside the fences, life took on a strange, almost peaceful rhythm. Prisoners rose at dawn, worked in nearby farms or factories, and spent their evenings writing letters home or attending English classes provided by American officers. Most of them were too young to understand what had truly happened in Europe. Many had never seen combat. They had been caught in retreat, surrounded while manning communication posts or transport lines. Others had been surrendered by officers who refused to sacrifice their men in hopeless resistance. But the hardest part for these young soldiers was not the imprisonment itself. It was the silence, the absence of news, the uncertainty about home. For months, letters from Germany rarely arrived. Allied bombings had reduced much of the postal system to rubble. Families were displaced or dead. The Red Cross struggled to keep track of millions of prisoners across continents. For the teenage POWs, home became an image, frozen in memory. A mother's voice, a farmhouse in the snow, a village bell tower at dusk. Some carried small photographs when they were captured, folded inside wallets or tucked under their shirts. But most of these were confiscated by American guards during intake, catalogued as personal effects for security. To the prisoners, it felt like losing the last link to their lives before the war. Those photographs were not trophies, they were lifelines. Meanwhile, in the United States, American civilians saw a different kind of enemy. Newspapers printed pictures of blonde, blue-eyed German boys working in fields and canning factories. They didn't look like the enemy described in wartime propaganda. They looked like sons. Farmers who hired them through the POW labor program often returned them small gestures of kindness. A meal, a smile, a handshake. It was not forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. In the camps, American officers noticed the psychological toll. These teenagers were disciplined but broken, not in spirit but in faith. They had been raised to believe in a Führer who promised eternal victory. Now, in captivity, surrounded by the efficiency and abundance of the very nation they were told was barbaric, they began to question everything. And it was during these quiet months of captivity that the idea of returning their confiscated belongings, including their family photos, began to take shape. It was not an official military operation, but rather a small act of humanity initiated by officers and Red Cross volunteers who believed that compassion could do what propaganda never could, reveal the truth of shared humanity beneath the uniform. For many of the German teenagers behind the barbed wire, that gesture would become the most unforgettable moment of their captivity. Because before the war truly ended, before the ships took them home, they would see their families again, not in person, but through the thin, fragile paper of a photograph. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the world stood in ruins. Cities lay in ashes, and an entire generation of soldiers, many of them teenagers, were scattered across continents as prisoners of war. For the United States, the German POWs were no longer enemies to defeat, but responsibilities to uphold. Across 511 major camps and over 700 branch camps, the U.S. military managed one of the largest prisoner networks in modern history. In places like Camp Hearne in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, and Camp Swift near Austin, tens of thousands of German soldiers lived behind wire fences that stretched for miles. Each camp functioned like a small city, with barracks, mess halls, clinics, and even theaters. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment, and the Americans, determined to demonstrate moral superiority, took that obligation seriously. Prisoners received the same rations as U.S. troops. They were allowed to organize recreation, form orchestras, publish camp newspapers, and even stage plays. Some camps had small libraries filled with donated German books. It was an environment that, to the young Germans, felt almost surreal after years of hunger, fear, and propaganda. Yet beneath the surface, a silent struggle unfolded. These boys were not just captives. They were children of a fallen ideology. Many had been indoctrinated since childhood. They had pledged allegiance not just to Germany, but to Hitler personally. And now, they found themselves standing in American fields, picking cotton or harvesting corn for the very people they had been told were subhuman. At first, suspicion ran deep. When American guards handed them cigarettes or coffee, many prisoners refused, thinking the gifts were poisoned. They whispered to one another that this was all a trick, that soon the executions would begin. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, something shifted. Kindness began to disarm fear. The American guards, many barely older than their prisoners, treated them not as monsters, but as boys far from home. Simple gestures, a smile, a shared meal, a word of respect, slowly pierced through the layers of hatred that propaganda had built. The Red Cross and U.S. Army chaplains played a quiet but powerful role in this transformation. They organized mail routes to reconnect prisoners with their families in Germany. They created tracing offices for missing persons. And, crucially, they cataloged the confiscated belongings, watches, medals, diaries, and photographs that had been separated from their owners when they were captured. For many POWs, the arrival of mail became a sacred ritual. Letters were read aloud in barracks, sentences whispered and translated for those who could not write. Paper and ink were rare treasures. Every word from home was a fragment of normal life restored. But photographs, those were different. A photograph could collapse the distance between two worlds. It was more than an image. It was proof that life still existed beyond the wire. In 1945, Red Cross volunteers began a meticulous process of returning personal items that had been gathered by field units in Europe. The process was slow, and not every item made it home. But when a lost photograph found its way back to its owner, it carried the weight of a lifetime. One American lieutenant at Camp Hearne later recalled that the first time he handed a photo back to a German prisoner, the young man froze. He stared at it for a full minute, the officer wrote, as if afraid that looking too long would make it disappear. For these teenagers, the gesture shattered something deep inside, the illusion that the enemy was heartless. They realized that these Americans, men who had every reason to hate them, were capable of compassion. The war had taught them to kill. Captivity was teaching them to feel again. Some began learning English. Others volunteered for agricultural work outside the camp, enjoying a strange kind of freedom under guard. They earned small wages, wrote more letters, and even started friendships with American civilians. But none of it compared to that moment when an officer or chaplain handed them a small envelope, and inside, the ghost of home looked back at them from a piece of paper worn thin by time. Those moments, quietly witnessed in dozens of camps across America, marked the beginning of something unexpected, reconciliation born not in conferences or treaties, but in the simple act of returning what war had taken away. And for the teenage POWs, it was only the beginning. Because in the days that followed, a few more crates arrived from Europe, each filled with remnants of lives interrupted, and those returns would reveal the most human side of a war that had forgotten what humanity looked like. They were soldiers only by name. Most of them had never chosen the uniform they wore. The German war machine, in its final desperation, had consumed its own youth, drafting boys who still carried schoolbooks, not rifles. Inside the American camps, these teenagers shed their illusions one day at a time. They no longer spoke of victory or Hitler. They spoke of food, of home, of whether their villages still stood. For many, the transition from indoctrinated fighter to frightened adolescent happened quietly, during long nights staring at the stars above Texas, Kansas, or Louisiana. Some had seen combat, others had only seen retreat. Many had lost friends in the chaos of the Western Front. When the Americans handed them back their photographs, those memories came rushing back. Birthdays, family gatherings, the smell of bread in the kitchen. The war had taken everything abstract, ideology, empire, Führer, and replaced it with something achingly human, longing. The simple act of holding a picture of home forced these young prisoners to confront what they had truly lost. Behind every trembling hand was not guilt for defeat, but grief for innocence. In the barracks, silence often followed these moments. No one mocked another man's tears. They all understood. For the American guards, the experience was disorienting in its own way. They had fought their way through Europe, through the blood-soaked fields of Normandy and the frozen forests of the Ardennes. They had seen friends die at the hands of the Wehrmacht. To them, German had meant enemy. But now, behind the wire, they saw boys, scared, polite, and barely able to shave. Many guards admitted in letters home that they could not hate these prisoners. Some even pitied them. They look like kids from back home, one Texan corporal wrote in a letter preserved in the Camp Hearne archives. If it weren't for the uniforms, you'd think they were farmhands from Kansas. The Americans had expected defiance or arrogance. Instead, they saw bewilderment. And when the crates of returned personal effects arrived, photographs, letters, trinkets, the guards were told to help distribute them. The scene that followed left an imprint on every man who witnessed it. One guard later recalled, "They lined up in silence. When I handed one boy a photo of his mother, he just stood there crying. He tried to salute me, but his hand wouldn't stop shaking." To the Americans, it was the moment they realized something powerful. Propaganda worked both ways. They had been told the enemy was evil. But here, in the quiet of a Texas morning, they saw only sons. War teaches men to dehumanize, to strip the enemy of his face, his name, his story. That's how killing becomes possible. But in captivity, that illusion began to crack. The moral confrontation in these camps wasn't fought with weapons. It was fought with empathy. The act of returning a photograph was small, almost administrative, yet it carried immense moral weight. It said, "You are still someone's son, someone's brother, someone's child." American officers who participated in these returns often wrote that it changed them, too. Many confessed that it reminded them of the thin line between justice and vengeance. They had lost friends in the war, men burned in tanks, shot from the sky, yet here they were, handing mercy to those who had once aimed rifles at them. That paradox defined the quiet moral revolution within the camps. It wasn't about forgiveness, not yet. It was about rediscovering what separated civilization from savagery. One chaplain at Camp Algona, Iowa, said it best in a report to the War Department. "In giving them back what was taken, we gave them back a part of their humanity. And in doing so, we began to heal a part of our own." This gesture did not erase the horrors of the war, but it revealed something enduring, that morality could survive even amid its ashes. There are moments in war that never make it into textbooks, moments too small to be strategic, too quiet to be heroic. Yet these are the moments that define the souls of men. When a teenage POW received his photo back, there was often no sound, no speech, just stillness. A hand covering a face. A sob muffled by the collar of a uniform. A picture pressed against the heart. These were the tears of boys who had never been allowed to cry. Under Nazi rule, emotion had been weakness. Compassion forbidden. The Führer demanded loyalty, not love. But in those American camps, surrounded by the simplicity of life, the laughter of guards, the taste of fresh bread, the sight of a sunset unbroken by smoke, these boys learned again what it meant to feel. For some, it was too much. A few refused to accept the photos, unable to face what they had lost. Others carried them everywhere, tucked into pockets during labor shifts or pinned beside their bunks. Those faded images, mothers, fathers, siblings, became sacred relics. Proof that beyond the fences, there was still a world worth believing in. And for the Americans who watched, it was impossible not to be moved. They saw the enemy tremble not from fear, but from memory. The photographs returned more than faces. They returned identity. They reminded both sides, captor and captive alike, that the war had been fought between human beings, not abstractions. And this growing recognition would soon expand into something larger, across nations, faiths, and politics, as new acts of compassion reshaped the meaning of victory itself. Culture had been one of the war's first casualties. For a decade, Germany's youth had been raised under banners of uniformity, taught to march in unison, to believe that art, music, and thought existed only to serve ideology. By 1945, many of these boys had never heard a foreign song, read a banned book, or seen a film not approved by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry. But in American POW camps, they encountered a different world, one that valued expression, individuality, and small pleasures. They heard country music drifting from radios in the guard towers. They saw American newspapers filled not with orders, but opinions. Some even attended church services where they were told that forgiveness was possible. The return of personal photos fit into this broader cultural awakening. It reintroduced them to something simple and profoundly human: family. For many, the idea of identity had been tied to the Reich, not to their own stories. Those photographs, a mother's face, a sister's smile, a family dog by a riverbank, reminded them of a culture that existed before the war, before the ideology. One former POW later told a German historian, "That photograph was the first time I remembered my real life. It was the first time I remembered being someone other than a soldier." Inside the camps, the young Germans began sketching, carving wood, writing letters, even forming orchestras that played Schubert and Beethoven. Art, which the Nazi regime had once weaponized, now became a language of reconciliation. What started as a military camp became an unexpected classroom, a place where defeated soldiers began to rediscover the parts of themselves the war had erased. The psychological transformation that occurred within these camps was quiet but profound. The boys arrived conditioned for obedience and fear. They had been told that capture was worse than death. Many expected torture or execution. Instead, they were given bread and work. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Psychologists who later studied German POWs in the U.S. described a process known as rehumanization. When captives are treated with dignity by an enemy they've been trained to hate, it forces the mind to reevaluate the lies that shaped it. For these teenagers, that process began not through lectures, but through gestures. A handshake, a shared cigarette, the return of a cherished photograph. That photograph became a psychological mirror. It reflected not only who they were, but who they had been before uniform and ideology. It grounded them in identity, in selfhood beyond the Reich. 4 months, American officers noted subtle changes. The boys became calmer, more reflective, more willing to talk about guilt and confusion. Some began to write diaries, processing their emotions for the first time. The military psychologists called it moral reawakening. But it was fragile. Every letter from home could bring both hope and pain. Some learned that their parents were missing, their towns destroyed, their siblings dead. For them, the returned photographs became both comfort and curse, a glimpse of a world they could never return to. Yet even through grief, a kind of healing began. Because for the first time, the enemy allowed them to mourn. The story of the returned photographs was not a single event, but a mosaic of small, compassionate acts that unfolded across dozens of camps. The U.S. Army's Office of the Provost Marshal General, in cooperation with the International Committee of the Red Cross, coordinated the handling of German personal effects found on the European front. When possible, these items were tagged, logged, and shipped to the camps where the owners were held. Camp Hearne, Camp Algona, Camp Concordia, all received shipments at different times in 1945 and 1946. The process was bureaucratic but deeply human. Each parcel was checked for contraband, then distributed under supervision. The returns were documented in administrative records, often accompanied by notations like photo album returned to owner or family picture received with gratitude. These files, preserved today in the U.S. National Archives, form a quiet testimony to a rare moment in history when compassion overruled vengeance. Historians often point out that the United States, though far from perfect, adhered closely to the Geneva Convention in its handling of German POWs. Unlike in many Axis camps, where starvation and brutality were common, the American approach sought to demonstrate democracy through action. The goal was not only control, but moral contrast. It worked. When the prisoners were eventually repatriated, thousands carried stories home that challenged the Nazi myth of the barbaric American. They spoke of fair treatment, of unexpected kindness, of a photograph handed back by a guard who smiled instead of shouted. Those stories would ripple through post-war Germany, shaping how a defeated nation saw its conqueror, not as an oppressor, but as a model of humanity. War often demands that morality be suspended. But in these camps, morality became a quiet act of resistance. Resistance against hatred, against indifference, against the easy cruelty that had consumed Europe for years. For the American officers who chose to return those photos, it was more than kindness. It was principle. They believed that the measure of victory was not in how one destroyed an enemy, but in how one treated him after defeat. The photographs symbolized that belief. They were a small restoration of dignity, a reminder that even in victory, the moral compass could remain true. This idea, that compassion can exist without weakness, would become a cornerstone of the American post-war ethos. It influenced how the U.S. handled Reconstruction, how it treated former enemies, and how it helped rebuild the world it had once fought to save. In the stillness of those camps, among boys who had once sworn allegiance to tyranny, a simple truth emerged. War ends not when weapons fall silent, but when humanity returns. Those acts of decency, quiet, unrecorded, and deeply human, set the stage for what would come next. The unforgettable moment when compassion broke through the last barrier between enemies, changing both sides forever. It was late summer, August 1945, 3 months after Germany's surrender. The war in Europe was officially over, yet in the heart of Texas, one camp still pulsed with the echo of conflict. At Camp Hearne, the air shimmered with heat. Rows of barracks stood silent under a pale sun. Beyond the wire, the fields buzzed with crickets. Inside, hundreds of young German POWs gathered in the open yard, summoned for an announcement. An American truck rolled in, coated in dust from the road. Soldiers climbed down carrying wooden crates marked with red wax seals and faint stencils that read, "Returned personal effects, European theater." The men standing in line didn't understand at first. They whispered among themselves. Some thought it was a roll call for repatriation. Others assumed it was just another inspection. But then one of the officers, Captain Harold Moore, stepped forward, a clipboard in his hand. He cleared his throat and said, "We've received your belongings from Europe. Some of these came from the front, others from Red Cross depots. We're returning them to their owners." For a moment, the yard went still. The only sound was the wind brushing against the fence. Then the officer called the first name. A teenager, blonde, thin, no older than 17, stepped forward. He walked stiffly, unsure whether to salute. The captain handed him a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased but intact. A family gathered around a table in what looked like Munich, smiling, unaware of what the future held. The boy froze. His lips trembled. Then, as if realizing the image was real, he let out a sound, half gasp, half sob, and pressed the photograph to his chest. Around him, the others stared. Some shifted uneasily, afraid to show emotion in front of the Americans. Others could not help it. Tears came freely. The distribution continued. Each name called was another life reclaimed from the ruins of Europe. Photographs, lockets, watches, prayer cards, sometimes even a child's drawing, each returned to hands that had long believed them lost forever. In the records of Camp Hearne's quartermaster office, there exists an inventory log from August 1945 listing miscellaneous personal items repatriated from European combat zones. It notes that many prisoners expressed gratitude and emotion upon receipt. Those dry words on paper cannot capture what the guards saw that day. Sergeant Robert Hayes, one of the men tasked with overseeing the return, later described it in a letter to his wife. "I've seen battlefields, I've seen men die. But today, I saw boys cry like they were children again. One of them kissed the picture over and over. Another just sat on the ground and stared at it for what felt like hours. It was as if we'd handed them back their souls." For the young prisoners, the shock was indescribable. Many of them had not heard from their families in over a year. Allied bombings had destroyed entire towns. They didn't know if their homes still stood, or if anyone was left to return to. So when they saw those faces, smiling, alive, frozen in happier days, the photographs became both a blessing and a burden. Some wept openly. Others turned away, unable to look. A German interpreter assigned to the camp later wrote in his diary, "They trembled not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of memory." In that moment, they were no longer soldiers. They were sons. That same day, Captain Moore noticed something unexpected. After the distribution, several German prisoners approached the guards voluntarily. They wanted to show their photographs, to explain who was in them. "This is my mother," one said in broken English. "She liked apples." "This is my sister," said another. "She was learning piano." The guards nodded, unsure what to say. One American leaned forward, pulled from his own wallet a folded photo of his wife and baby back in Ohio. For a long moment, the two men, captor and captive, stood side by side, each holding a photograph of home. The wire fence between them suddenly seemed invisible. No speeches, no politics, just two human beings remembering what they were fighting for. By sunset, the yard was quiet again. The crates were empty, their contents scattered among the men like fragments of lost lives. In the barracks that night, the prisoners placed their photographs on makeshift shelves, under pillows, or beside their bunks. Some sang softly old folk songs from Bavaria and the Rhineland. Others simply stared at the fading images until they fell asleep. An American guard walking the night shift later said that, for the first time since he'd arrived at the camp, he heard laughter. Faint, distant, but real. The act of returning those photographs did not change the course of history. It did not undo the devastation that had swept across Europe. But for the young men behind the wire, it was proof that compassion still existed, proof that the world beyond uniforms and orders could still be kind. In those fragile moments, a quiet reconciliation began, one that would echo long after the barbed wire was gone. And in the following weeks, as more shipments arrived from Europe and more photos were returned, something extraordinary began to happen. Prisoners who had once refused to speak of their past started opening up. Some wrote letters of gratitude to their captors. Others began to tell their stories. What followed would become one of the most deeply human chapters of the POW experience. A chapter where compassion became contagious, spreading from one act of mercy to an entire camp. In the weeks that followed that first August afternoon, word spread quickly across Camp Hearne and neighboring POW sites. The photograph day, as the Germans came to call it, became something almost sacred. Each new shipment that arrived from Europe carried not just objects, but echoes of lives that had been suspended in time. Crates marked personal effects were unloaded with a kind of reverence. The Americans handled them carefully now, aware of their power, aware that within each envelope might lie a face, a name, a reason to hope. The returns were organized methodically. Prisoners were called by number, not rank. For once, there was no hierarchy, only humanity. The Americans made sure every man received his due, even if the item was small or nearly worthless in material value. One afternoon, a guard opened a parcel containing a child's drawing, crayon on thin paper, edges torn. It depicted a house, a tree, and two stick figures holding hands. On the back was written, in careful German handwriting, "For Papa, komm bald heim." "For Daddy, come home soon." The guard stood still for a long moment before handing it to its owner, a young corporal named Karl Metz. Metz stared at the paper, then folded it gently and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "She was 6 when I left," he whispered. Moments like that rippled through the camp like quiet thunder. The prisoners who once avoided the Americans now began to greet them. Some asked about baseball, others about jazz. The small gestures, a nod, a shared cigarette, a word of thanks, built invisible bridges over wounds that propaganda had carved. But beyond the fences, the outside world was changing fast. Germany lay in ruins. News arrived slowly through the Red Cross. Cities destroyed, families displaced, the nation divided into zones of occupation. The young POWs listened in disbelief as American newspapers read aloud reports of the Nuremberg trials, of the horrors of the concentration camps, of what their government had done in their name. Many refused to believe it at first. Others wept silently. It was in this moral storm that the photographs gained even deeper meaning. They were reminders not only of home, but of what must be rebuilt, what must never be lost again. An American chaplain at Camp Hearne, Reverend Joseph Kent, later wrote, "Those photos did what sermons could not. They taught the boys what it meant to be human again. They remembered love, and in remembering, they began to understand guilt." The photographs became symbols of survival, fragments of innocence in a time when innocence had all but vanished. Some prisoners began drawing portraits of one another. Others sent sketches of camp life to their families, hoping to reassure them they were alive. A few Americans, moved by what they had witnessed, helped prisoners write letters to the Red Cross, asking for updates about relatives. When word came that a mother or sister had survived, the entire barracks would celebrate as though victory had finally come. There were also harder moments. Not all news was good. When a photograph was returned but no living family remained, silence filled the room like a fog. One boy, barely 16, received a letter confirming his parents had died in Dresden during the February bombings. He folded the letter, placed it beneath his pillow, and refused to speak for 3 days. But even in grief, he was not alone. Fellow prisoners comforted him. One American guard, breaking regulation, brought him a small chocolate bar, his own ration. The boy accepted it wordlessly, tears streaking his dust-covered face. Such acts of quiet compassion blurred the lines between victor and vanquished. They did not erase the past, but they softened its edges. By late 1946, the United States began the process of repatriation. The war was long over, and the time had come to send the German prisoners home. The men packed what little they owned, handmade souvenirs, camp drawings, and, above all, their photographs. At the docks, before boarding the ships bound for Bremen and Le Havre, American officers conducted final inspections. They watched as the young Germans carefully tucked the photos into their uniforms, inside pockets over their hearts. One officer later wrote in his journal, "They guarded those pictures as if they were medals. But they weren't reminders of war. They were reminders of peace, of what they were returning to, and what they hoped to rebuild." When the ships departed, the harbor was silent except for the hum of engines and the sound of flags snapping in the wind. Some Americans waved. A few prisoners waved back. Between them stretched not hatred, but something far more enduring, respect. Months later, in post-war Germany, stories of life in the American camps began to circulate. They spread through letters, whispers, and newspaper articles. People were astonished to hear that the Americans had returned personal belongings, that they had treated prisoners with fairness, that they had given them back their family photographs. For a nation shattered by defeat and moral collapse, these accounts became small seeds of hope. They helped shape a new image of America, not just as conqueror, but as liberator. One former POW, interviewed decades later, summed it up simply. "When they gave me that photo, they gave me back my humanity. That's when I stopped being a soldier and started being a man again." That was the true turning point, not the surrender of armies, not the fall of Berlin, but the quiet rediscovery of what war had tried to erase, the ability to care. And in that fragile exchange between young men on opposite sides of history, a photograph returned, a tear shed, a silent nod. The war at last began to end. When the transports carrying the German prisoners finally reached Europe, winter had already settled across the continent. The year was 1946, and Germany was almost unrecognizable. Cities that had once stood proud, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, were now skeletons of brick and ash. Bridges lay collapsed into rivers, and roads ended in craters. For the returning POWs, it was like stepping into another planet. Many had left as soldiers of a powerful Reich. They came home as survivors to a nation erased. Their uniforms marked them as defeated, but their hearts carried something quietly defiant, the memory of humanity they had experienced in enemy hands. At ports like Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Bremen, Allied officers processed the men before releasing them into the ruins of their homeland. Red Cross officials gave each man a ration card, a medical check, and a small packet of belongings. Inside, often wrapped in wax paper to protect against moisture, was the same photograph they had received in America. For many, it was the only thing they owned. They walked home through wreckage and hunger, guided by instinct and the faint hope that someone still waited for them. Some found their houses flattened. Others found strangers living where their families had once been. But when they reached into their pockets and unfolded that photograph, the faces of mothers, sisters, or children, they remembered that love had survived even the war's longest shadow. The American POW program had not been perfect. There were moments of cruelty, misunderstandings, and bitterness. But compared to other nations, the U.S. treatment of German prisoners stood apart. According to post-war reports by the International Committee of the Red Cross and U.S. Army Archives, more than 370,000 German POWs were held in America between 1942 and 1946. Fewer than 1% died in captivity, a number almost unheard of in a global war where starvation and execution were common elsewhere. The Americans had followed the Geneva Convention of 1929 with remarkable consistency. Prisoners were given proper food, medical care, and opportunities for work, not as punishment, but as rehabilitation. Yet what truly lingered was not the statistics, but the emotional aftermath, the memory of decency. In post-war Germany, as the country began the long and painful process of denazification, many of these former POWs became quiet voices of moral transformation. They had seen both sides of humanity, the fanaticism that had led them to war, and the mercy that had met them in captivity. They spoke to friends and neighbors of how American guards shared food with them, how they were allowed to write letters, how chaplains returned their family photographs. These stories spread like sparks in a dark room, challenging the cynicism that had consumed the nation. Historians later called this phenomenon the re-education from within. It was not imposed through propaganda or force. It was learned through human contact. In 1947, as Reconstruction began under the Marshall Plan, American officials noticed something remarkable. Many of the German men returning from POW camps in the U.S. were less hostile, more open to cooperation than those who had remained in Europe. They were more willing to work with the occupying forces, to rebuild, to believe that peace was possible. Sociologists studying their reintegration described a common pattern. These men no longer viewed the Americans as faceless enemies. They remembered kindness, and that memory became a bridge between nations. Some of the young prisoners even wrote letters of thanks to their former guards. One such letter, preserved in the National Archives, reads, "You treated us with a dignity we did not deserve. I will never forget the day you handed me my family photograph. It taught me that the enemy can also be human. I have kept that picture ever since, as a reminder that mercy is stronger than hate." For others, the adjustment was not so easy. The Germany they returned to was broken, politically, economically, and spiritually. Some could not find their families. Some turned inward, burdened by guilt or silence. But even then, the experience of captivity had changed them. They had seen the enemy act with compassion, and it forced them to question everything they had once believed. Years later, when asked what had saved them, many of these former POWs gave the same quiet answer. It was the photograph. Because in that fragile image, returned by a foreign hand, they had glimpsed the truth that no war could erase, that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can still find a way to remember itself. And that truth would shape not just the men who lived it, but the future of two nations learning, together, what it meant to rebuild. The return of the German POWs to their homeland did more than reunite men with photographs. It created a subtle yet profound ripple across post-war Europe, affecting not only individuals, but also collective memory and national identity. Many towns that had survived bombings were overwhelmed by returning soldiers who carried more than physical belongings. They carried stories of humanity from the enemy they had been taught to hate. These accounts spread quietly through families, neighbors, and local communities. They became testimony that morality could exist even in war, and that compassion could be found on the battlefield, even amid devastation. Some former POWs credited the simple act of receiving back a photograph with saving them from despair. It reminded them that there was a world outside propaganda, destruction, and ideology, a world still filled with ordinary life, family, and love. One former teen soldier recalled decades later, "Holding that photo, I felt the war lift from my shoulders for the first time. It reminded me who I was before the madness began." The broader implications were equally significant. For the United States, The humane treatment of POWs reinforced its emerging role as a moral and cultural leader in post-war reconstruction. By demonstrating fairness, decency, and adherence to international law, the U.S. set a precedent for how conquered enemies could be treated with dignity. This approach influenced later policies during the occupation of Germany and Japan, contributing to reconciliation and stability. Meanwhile, the experiences of these young POWs informed post-war German society. Those who returned with stories of kindness, mercy, and returned personal effects carried with them lessons in ethical behavior and empathy. For many, this contrasted sharply with the indoctrination of Nazi youth programs and the culture of obedience and brutality they had been raised in. By witnessing compassion firsthand, they gained a model for rebuilding a society based on respect and humanity rather than fear. The photographs themselves became symbolic artifacts, tangible evidence that life, identity, and memory could endure even through catastrophe. Families who received images of their children, brothers, and husbands who had survived captivity found hope and reassurance. For the men themselves, the photos were a reminder of the fragile but persistent connection between home and self. Red Cross and military records document dozens of such returns. While the exact number of photographs delivered is unknown, dozens of personal accounts and letters survive, preserving the stories of gratitude and emotional transformation. Some prisoners carried these photographs for decades, placing them in wallets, albums, or simple frames, refusing to let them fade with time. The moral lessons of these moments also had a subtle psychological effect on both nations. Former German POWs often described a renewed understanding of justice and mercy, while American soldiers and officers recalled how witnessing vulnerability and grief transformed their perception of the enemy. Across hundreds of camps, small acts of kindness, returning a photograph, a letter, or a watch, slowly stitched together a fragile fabric of trust that would support post-war reconciliation. In essence, the photographs were more than paper and ink. They were catalysts of empathy, bridging the gulf between conqueror and captive, past and present, war and peace. They reminded young soldiers that they were more than pawns of a fallen regime. They were sons, brothers, and human beings capable of feeling, remembering, and rebuilding. By the time the last German POWs left American soil in 1946, the seeds planted in those camps had begun to grow. Former prisoners would carry lessons of compassion, mercy, and ethical treatment into rebuilding efforts, schools, and workplaces. They became part of a generation tasked with learning from catastrophe and ensuring that future wars would not erase the essential humanity of those caught in them. And in small, quiet moments, the folding of a photograph, the tracing of a smiling face, the whispered memory of home, the war's most enduring lesson remained clear. Even amid destruction, acts of kindness can survive, shaping hearts and nations long after the guns have fallen silent. The story of the German teenage POWs and their returned photographs is not one of battles or strategies. It is a story of something quieter, yet infinitely more profound: the endurance of humanity in the midst of devastation. A photograph, fragile and faded, survived the war when millions of lives did not. It carried no ideology, no orders, no propaganda, only the weight of memory, love, and identity. For the young POWs, it became a lifeline to a world that had been shattered, a reminder that even after destruction, the human heart could still feel, remember, and hope. The Americans who returned these items were acting not out of obligation alone, but out of conscience. In their simple acts, handing over an envelope, smiling at a trembling hand, acknowledging a mother's face, they demonstrated that mercy does not diminish justice, it strengthens it. They proved that even amid the machinery of war, individuals could make choices that preserved dignity. For the German teenagers, these moments redefined what it meant to be alive. They were no longer defined by uniforms, orders, or the ideology they had been forced to serve. They were sons, brothers, and human beings whose emotions, grief, and joy mattered. The war had taken their childhoods, but the photographs returned a piece of their humanity. History often remembers generals and battles, strategies and treaties. But the quiet moments, a photograph folded into a pocket, a tear shed in the sun, a memory rekindled, reveal a deeper truth, that the endurance of compassion and memory shapes not only the survivors, but the future itself. And so, in the stillness of a camp yard, under the hot sun of Texas or Kansas, a small act of humanity became immortal. It reminded both captor and captive that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit can survive, reconcile, and rebuild. Because sometimes, the most powerful victories are not measured in territory or conquest, but in the hearts that remember to care.